Hi, I'm Alex, and welcome to the Research Room, a space to make research by the people for the people.
Perfect synergy.
And today we're going to be continuing our conversation on pain. So last week we talked all about the biopsychosocial model, and I'll rehash that a little bit over here. But we're going to try something a little bit different. I'm going to be talking by myself for today. And I hope that I can get across a lot of different points here by just like explaining a little bit about research on pain and all the different findings that are out there. So this particular episode, it might be a little bit more on the heavy side, potentially. So I did want to just like give that warning beforehand when we're talking about race, when we're talking about ethnicity, when we talk about culture, and especially within America, that can be a very heavy topic. So if for any reason you feel like that might be too stressful, that's completely okay. But I do hope by the end of this that we have talked through a lot of the different considerations that we should be making when it comes to potentially all of the psychological aspects that come in with pain, as well as the social and the interactional sort of nature of pain. So that could definitely involve things like discrimination. So I'll also, before I jump into the actual content, I do want to say with this episode in particular, I want to be able to get feedback. I want to hear from you. That's going to be much more important than anything that I really have to say here. Um, and I say that because research, at least as it is right now, it's very limited. This is not perfect just yet. This is not all encompassing. We don't have the like holistic picture of the medical system and how it might end up treating different people differently based off of things like race and ethnicity. So especially if you feel like your experiences just don't match with this, that is very useful to know, and that will also help improve the research and hopefully improve this interaction as well. But I guess on the flip side, maybe everything does end up echoing your life in some way or another, or maybe you do resonate with this. That's also really good to know. That means that like research is actually on the right track. But either way, that kind of feedback is going to be great. So I did want to say that that's the whole purpose of the research room, really. Yes, we talk about research, we talk about findings, but that will only go so far because that is just how things happen on average. You have your own experiences, and your experiences are going to mean that much more. And your experiences might go along with their averages that we find in research. It might not. And either way, that's useful. So without further ado, I guess, the paper that I'm going to be discussing today is by Samantha Meintz and her colleagues. Back in 2019, she did a review, basically, of this whole topic. And she titled her paper, Racial and Ethnic Differences in the Experience and Treatment of Non-Cancer Pain. And I mean, that non-cancer pain, it seems oddly specific, but when thinking about pain, cancer patients and the pain that goes along with that is fairly different. It's a very different like beast to like handle. It comes with many other considerations that, of course, these things that I'll be talking about today, they influence, but there's so many other medications and so many other treatment options that go along with that it does make it a little bit more unique compared to maybe your everyday pain or just like other types of chronic pain. Um, so this is specifically about things that aren't cancer related. And so I did also want to do this earlier on in the series. This is the second within the pain series. So last week we definitely talked about like just a really broad model with Dr. Wright. And I think the biopsychosocial model is great, but this is us now really focusing in on the latter two, and especially I think the social aspects of this. So culture in general, that's something that's it leaks into most aspects of our lives, right? And I mean, culture is also very much tied to the idea of race or ethnicity. It doesn't have to be necessarily. You get culture from many other aspects of your life. That could be from like sexual orientation, that could be from your gender identity, that could be from just the nation that you live in, and how much you go along with that nation's ideals. It's also about like work potentially, right? Like, I mean, there's a culture of work, there's a culture of what you all end up agreeing upon as a group of people. That there are certain ways to act and certain ways not to act, certain ways to perceive things, certain ways not to perceive things. So all of that constitutes culture. And this specific episode will be thinking about culture as it specifically relates to race and ethnicity. So the ways that we are grouped together based predominantly on our skin color. And those experiences, I mean, it's not a great way of grouping people together, but it is certainly one way, and people end up having similar experiences because of things like skin color, and that's why I mean, like systematically, we do end up seeing these kinds of effects. So I guess what I want to say is that there's this is not going to be like fully exhaustive of everything as well. There's going to be a lot of things that I cover, hopefully. And I think also like if this goes on too long, I will stop and I'll probably I'll continue this next week. But hopefully I can fit in everything that I want to say here. So there's three different levels of things that go on with thinking about race and ethnicity as it might pertain to pain. So there are the patient factors, there are provider factors, and then there are system factors. And if you're also like thinking again about the biopsychosocial model, then the patient factors are that psychological factor. This is within you, the individual. What is your perception? What are your feelings? Things like that. And that's basically the same thing there. When it comes to provider factors, that is much more about the social aspects. This is how your provider is reacting to you and responding to you, and like the way that they approach your pain. So it's the social interactional nature. And then there is system factors, and this is going to be I mean, I think of it more as like an extension of the social. It is just the larger things that are also happening in society. So there are certain like things within the medical institutions that are like by law and that aren't by law, and like things like that. There's many things that are like government mandated, things that aren't government mandated. It's the access to things like insurance and things like that. These other just like factors that are surrounding your own psychology and the ways that we interact with others. In this specific paper, the patient factors that they pulled out were things like catastrophizing, also anything that deals with prayer or religious coping. And also deals with Stoicism and positive thinking and exercise. So these are some of the things that I'll be discussing. Then there's also, for the provider, the main thing that we want to focus on here is how bias and discrimination end up leaking into these pain conversations and these pain experiences, particularly for the patient. And then we also end up looking at the system factors. And this one, we really just want to end up looking at this idea of healthcare access and all the things that might go on with that, and how that ends up then influencing your outcomes when it comes to pain. And so with all these different factors, like, of course, like anyone could go down this list and like say yes or no to any of these things, right? But what makes this like especially like interesting is that potentially when you ask people of different backgrounds, of different racial ethnic backgrounds, that you'll find different patterns emerging. You'll find that different patient factors are more likely to emerge in certain groups of different backgrounds. You'll find that maybe certain things don't come up for other people, right? So like maybe for some people, it's really all about the patient and what the provider does doesn't really matter because they're having a really good interaction with each other. Or it could be the exact opposite, where I mean, like your hands are really in the hands of I mean, your fate is really in the hands of the provider. And I mean, maybe you have really bad interactions with them, and that ends up going down a whole different like set of consequences, right? So you can think of like how this might if you wanted to compare people that are black versus people that are white, you can see that there might be differences in like, does the provider matter? Does the system level factors matter? Or is it more about the individual? Or is it like really an interplay between all three of these things? Um, if you think about men versus women and how those factors again might play out, if you want to think about this like more intersectionally, you can think about how for Black women, maybe this is going to be different compared to white women. Same for Black men or white men. So all these things, I think you could look at any group of people and just the way that these three things might show up in these pain experiences are going to be slightly different, and that's exactly why we need to talk about it. So I guess I'll also say very quickly, and I was going back and forth on like, do I actually want to like have like a podcast episode on this? I think for now, at least, I will just leave it here at the conclusion of what a certain meta-analysis found, and why we do need to really consider all these other factors. So this meta-analysis, so a collection of studies to see what the average effect is across all these studies, they were looking at potential discrimination when it comes to especially looking at pain relief and the medication that doctors will provide. And so what they did was across all these different studies, they looked through, they found they looked at what the conclusions were at each of these studies, and they found that on average, any person of color, when they visit emergency departments, and so this was specifically for emergency departments, if they end up seeing a doctor for pain, any person of color, whether that is Asian, whether that is Hispanic, whether that is Black, or even Native American, also Hawaiian Pacific Islander, for any person of color, they ended up leaving the emergency room less likely to have something to actually relieve their pain. And this is all compared to white individuals. So why, right? Like the huge question there would be why? Why would this happen so repeatedly and so like reliably, where white individuals are more likely to have that treatment in hand once they leave versus people of color? And that's exactly why I'm going to have this conversation regarding these other factors. So this paper that I'm talking about today, it was another review. So they collected a lot of different information here, and they went through a lot of different studies to find what are the main patterns that are coming out. And so they're finding. I'll go through this one by one on each of the different levels. So for the psychological aspects, things like catastrophizing again. So what does that even mean, right? Catastrophizing is just when you think about things in a very extreme way. If you think that because something happened to you, like maybe your life is over, and maybe it's not actually necessary to like think of it in that kind of way. Of course, there's certain things that like it is super necessary to, but it's an inappropriate conclusion based off of the actual circumstances. And so you might hear people say things like I feel like I can't go on when it comes to pain, or when like if they end up saying things like if I don't get the help right now, then I will end up just like my whole life is going to be ruined if I don't get this help, or like maybe they just think that the pain is going to last forever and there's no cure for it or anything like that. Like it's it's turning the potentials into extremes, and as you can imagine, like that's not going to end up like leading to very favorable kind of outcomes. When people end up catastrophizing, that usually ends up reducing things like well-being and dissatisfaction with things. And in this case, they also end up feeling more pain. So this, of course, would happen across the board. But we also end up seeing that there is this difference when it comes to race ethnicity, that those that are Black and those that are Hispanic, they tend to catastrophize more often than whites. And yeah, I mean, this leads to more stress when it comes to their pain experience, which is going to worsen the outcomes. So why, again, why would that ever happen? And I have a few different reasons. But I guess maybe even before that, I'll just quickly say that like catastrophizing isn't necessarily bad. But I will say also, on average, it doesn't lead to the best outcomes. So what I mean by that is there are some times where, let's say you are catastrophizing and like you're really catastrophizing because you want to like evoke a good response from somebody else, because you really need that support in that moment. And when you are making it super clear, like this is how I'm feeling, I feel like I really need help right now. Hopefully you have a good support system and they actually like hear you and they end up like meeting your needs in that moment. And I mean, sometimes like, yeah, I mean, do that, of course, right? That's completely okay. Like to want support, that's not something that you should ever feel bad about. So this is just one way to get that response. Are there other ways? Of course, but this is one way. So why might that happen again? So if in this case, if people are not being heard, and they might feel like they have to resort to catastrophizing. If you feel like you've explained your condition so many times, if you've explained the way that you feel so many times, and you haven't gotten that support yet, then you might feel like you need to really like increase the way that you're expressing it. You have to make it a little bit more dramatic in your face, and you can't ignore it if that's the case, right? But of course, I mean, we know that some people do still. They will continue to dismiss you and things like that. And so this is obviously something I'll talk about in more detail later. But the idea that certain people just are not going to be listened to, they're not going to be understood, that absolutely happens on the basis of skin color and race and ethnicity. And so it's learned that like you really need to speak above and beyond to be heard. And so this idea of catastrophizing definitely it goes hand in hand with that. I'll leave that alone for now because there's so many other things I want to get to. When it comes to religion, I think this is a huge one, especially, I mean, globally, right? Like it doesn't matter a lot of things. Like plenty of people are religious, and so they also just end up turning to religion to cope, and that of course that makes total sense. When it comes to this, there are definitely mixed findings, though. So religion, I think it can be great because it allows you to soothe your emotional state. It allows you to feel like you are supported, like even if you don't have like that human connection and support, like you can say like you leave it in the hands of God, and that's going to be what gets you through something. And there's absolutely research that goes along with this that says those that are more religious and that pray more often, they end up having higher well-being because they're more satisfied with like, oh, like it really helped them with the process. It really helped them continue adhering to medication. It really helped you do all these things, right? But there's the other side of it, which is potentially if you are only relying on it and you don't end up ever actually talking to a doctor, and or if you do talk to a doctor and then you leave it being like, I mean, what do they know? Like I have this religion to turn to instead, and that can be a very hard thing to grapple with because then I mean, so the word in research would be that this is a more passive approach. That this is a passive coping technique, and so it's not actively addressing the pain. Instead, it's only focusing on your emotions, and so again, that can be great. But if you don't end up like not getting the medication that you need, if you end up not getting the treatment that you need, or if you just kind of like delay it longer and longer, then that's where it can be it can show these more like negative outcomes. And so again, this is different depending on race, ethnicity. That if you are someone who's Black, or if you're Hispanic, then you tend to gravitate more toward religion. And that's, again, that's so many factors that go into that. There's going to be like a distrust of the medical system, and for good reasons, right? That there's so many more people of color that end up dying in the hands of medical professionals. Maybe you also just like you're not understanding what's actually happening. You don't understand what the diagnosis is. You don't understand what the treatment options are, and you end up just turning to religion rather than these other potential like proactive things that you could be doing for your own health. And so um yeah, that's the basic thing on that. There's so much more research that needs to be done here, though. These are just some of the like, I mean, I kind of even want to say like just preliminary like kind of findings, because there's so much more to look into here. um I guess, yeah, some of the things that you might want to look into is like, for all these things, right? Like, there's no one size fits all. There's no like, because you are a certain group, because you are religious or not, because you pray to a certain God or not, right? Like all of those things, like there's no one answer that comes out of that. So we need to continue like figuring out like what are these other like specifics like on here. So whether you maybe you belong to a certain sect within Christianity, and of course Christianity is one of the biggest ones here, because within America, people of color and also white individuals, like that's the predominant religion. So really doing some like fine grained like detailed work on that, like maybe we'll find some other answers there. um, because yeah, I mean the doctrines that go on with like someone who is Catholic versus Protestant are going to be different, and the way that you might enact religion in your own health is going to be different. So yes, more things to consider. um, there's this idea of Stoicism. And so Stoicism is literally just like you aren't expressing anything, right? That this also ends up becoming a culture thing. That and so the majority of the research that's been done in the medical literature that deals with pain is on Hispanic individuals. And so here it is that um, this idea of Stoicism, again, like it has pros and cons. Um, but as far as pain goes, mostly negatives, unfortunately, because that means that you are ignoring what's happening, and you're ignoring the pain, you're ignoring the signs that like you actually need to talk to somebody to like help with this condition that you're having. But the flip side of that is the psychology behind it is you want to not express what you're feeling, because that is going to be very burdensome to other people. That means that if you are now concentrating on your pain, that you are not doing the work that you need to be doing. You're not providing for your family in the way that you need to. Maybe you need to be out like doing chores. So maybe you need to be cooking, maybe you need to be cleaning, maybe you need to be picking up your children, like whatever it is. Like this pain kind of thing is just kind of a distraction, right? Like it's you don't need it right now, and that's not going to change the circumstances that like these other things need to happen. So you become stoic, and you don't end up actually like thinking about your pain and expressing it in the ways that it needs to be expressed. um, this really is like, I think it's such a like great thought, right? That like you want to be able to just like fend for your family, and that you want to do something for them. But if you don't end up taking care of yourself, like that ends up like making things much worse, because let's say you're having this pain and that needs to be checked out, and that could be like a very like preventative sort of thing, right? That if you got that help earlier, that would help prevent later consequences. And you end up actually like being able to help your family more, because you took care of the thing first, rather than leaving it until later. And yeah, I mean, that's, and unfortunately, like it's just, it's not the case that happens, and that it again that it happens along these lines of race ethnicity, and it's not something to like be judgmental about. It's much more something to just be aware about and to be able to like talk to people about, especially if you are a medical provider, right? Like to know that these are some of the things that are happening in your patients' minds, and knowing that this is the psychology that they're bringing to the interaction here. And so the more that that can happen, the better that the interaction is going to be. The more that you can talk through what are the actual like outcomes here, and all the other like options of like, if you do this now, then like you can prevent this later, like things like that. Um, yeah, there's so many like different framing kind of messages there. I think the last thing I'll talk about here for the psychology, and like I'm looking at the time like there's no way I can get through everything here. So I'll see. Maybe this is I'll end up like writing about this a little bit more because there's so much to talk about here. Or maybe I do end up doing another podcast episode on this, like because yeah, I mean it's great to just like sit and like think about and like see how's this actually relating to your own life, like has any of this been true for you so far? This is what studies have found, but like, is this true for you? And is this something that now you can like either take with you, or is this something that like maybe you need to like rethink, or maybe we need to rethink, right? So, last thing I'll say for psychology is that there's this idea that you can be very optimistic about things if you have positive thinking going into these interactions that you have with a provider, and if you also like are physically active, like physical activity is probably one of the best interventions out there when it comes to a lot of different conditions that we face as humans. Um, Understandably, not a lot of people like that, but the research does show that it ends up being the like among the most like reliable positive things that we can do for our lives. And so this happens on the basis of race ethnicity, at least on average, that Asians tend to engage in positive thinking and in exercise a little bit more, and that helps the overall functioning that much more, right? I think that is fairly straightforward. So I won't talk too much about that, but I will just say that that could go wrong as well, right? So like for any of these things, like there's never again the one size fits all. Like every situation is going to be a little bit different. Exercise is not going to fix everything, right? If you end up exercising when you have like severe pain and you end up making the condition worse, like that is not going to help anybody. So things to think about that, like I don't want you to just like walk away and like be like, oh, like I'm in pain so I'm gonna go exercise now. That is not the message. But thinking about on average that if you are physically active, that could help with these kinds of conditions, and having that optimism alongside of it is great. um, Maybe I will just say like a couple more points before letting this go for today. But I literally could talk for another at least half hour on some of these things. So what I do want to say is again, with everything that I've said so far, there are things that are on average. I think their points, whether they are the first steps or they're more in the middle or whatever, right? Like wherever that is, as far as the research goes, there's more work to do. There's more to actually figure out here. There's more to uncover. And so with any of this, if it hasn't resonated with you, if it has resonated with you, we still need to figure out why this is all happening. And we need to continue to disentangle this. Like, is it really race ethnicity? Is it really other cultural things? What is like the actual process of events here, right? Because I mean, simple things like what exactly is catastrophizing from culture to culture, from ethnic background to ethnic background? What exactly is Stoicism? in these different cultures, and thinking about like what are the precursors, what are the predictors of this, why are people engaging in this. Like we have some ideas, but really understanding like, oh, this is actually why they're doing this, and like that makes sense. Like we can work with that kind of thing, and like if we can work with that, that means like, well, we can also potentially change that. um, like it's again, there are pros and cons to all of this, and I mean, to some degree, it's going to be just like what do you value out of this? Like, I hope that you always value yourself and your own health and your own well-being. But understandably, circumstances can be very tough, and you just end up focusing more on like your family and like what can you do for them, how can you provide for them. Or if you are very like anxious and fearful of like what are the potential situations that you might get yourself into in this medical like field. You don't know these doctors, you don't know, you don't necessarily trust them, you don't know what the treatment options are, you don't know how that's going to be affecting you, you don't know how long you have to like take off from work, you don't know if you're going to be able to afford it. If you're less likely to have the insurance, that's going to be, it's gonna be tough, right? To ever pay for this, even with insurance. Like it's gonna be tough to pay for some of these things. Like unfortunately, we just don't have the best like healthcare system in that kind of regard in America. So of course, these are all considerations that you should be making, and these are not just considerations you should be making alone. These should be things that you can talk through with your provider, and that they should be able to be like open to like that conversation and actually like discuss with you like, hey, like I hear you on this, have you thought about it this way, or whatever it is, right? To make sure that people are living the healthiest and less like least pain-free lives as possible. Like that'd be great. um so yeah, I mean, I made a dent into the psychological factors. um so the things that are still here, that are on the table to talk about, there's still the whole idea of perceived bias and discrimination, which we absolutely know is true, that this happens. It's reported that half of Hispanic speaking people, um, they end up perceiving that they have been discriminated against. So 50%. This only increases for Black Americans, that it's actually up to 70% that feel like they have been discriminated at some point. And so, of course, with discrimination comes more stress and just less like mental faculty to like deal with the pain, or like deal with the pain in like an adaptive way, or like whatever, right? Like it's tough, right? Like if you're bogged down by life, and not because of anything that you've ever done, just because society treats you a certain way and perceives you a certain way, that's going to get in the way of being able to take care of yourself. And like we have to like do something about that. Like we can't just like leave that there, right? So I I want to say so many things, but okay, I'm gonna continue a little bit. Because I think it'd be nice to hear the rest of this. So I'm gonna try to pick out some of the main points here. Um, I could go in more detail on any of these in future episodes if anyone does want to hear more. But let me just like pick out a few things. So maybe the biggest way that people of color feel discriminated against and just like misunderstood in general when it comes to these doctor-patient interactions is that there's three things. So there is the idea that their pain just isn't being understood. And so this could be evidenced by things like maybe your provider is asking so many questions and it's just like, okay, so like, well, I have to explain so much just like get like heard here. So maybe you're not understanding something, like something is missing. Or it could be like your provider, like maybe they heard everything that you said, but like they just didn't actually like respond. And like you would think that like, oh, like I'm in pain here, like you would actually respond if you understood like that I was actually in pain, right? Um, so there's that whole idea that like they don't feel like their pain is being understood. There's the idea that maybe your pain is being heard at the very least, but like it's not being believed. That and this might come across in ways of like maybe your provider is saying like, oh, like did that really happen, or like are you sure you're feeling that way, or like things like that, like these clarifications that like as long as you were paying attention and like heard them, like don't need to be questioned. Maybe you want to ask like other questions about like, oh, like what happened right before that pain, or like what's happening now, or like things like that. But like those other like questions can be very dismissing, that you're not being believed here, and maybe you feel like maybe you shouldn't have any right to like be here in this interaction and like say anything more about your pain, or they just feel like their provider doesn't care. Maybe they understand that you're in pain. Maybe they understand that, how it happened and all that, and like what we can do about it. But they just don't really care. They're not showing any kind of like empathy for your pain, or any like proactive like treatment for it. And they just like move on to something else, which like potentially there is something else to talk about in that meeting, but yeah, I mean, you were here for pain, so like you still want to talk about pain, and what to do about that. So those are three main reasons for why this ends up happening. This is perceived discrimination. Um, of course, when all these things happen, then that leads to things like hopelessness. That I mean, you came to a person literally for help, and that person is not helping you. So you feel a little bit less hopeful about like, oh, like this can be a positive thing. Like, yes, I can actually like get help for this. Like, and like again, that sort of like leads back to this idea of like catastrophizing. That like, if you're feeling discriminated against, like, oh, maybe it is actually logical to think that like, oh, I'm never going to get help because this provider, like this person who's literally, I'm paying you to help me right now, but I'm not being helped. Um, that that can end up and through like a whole negative cycle of things, that lead to that catastrophizing. There are also just other misconceptions that lead to bias, which like these are things that are like literally never taught, but for whatever reason, doctors just have this perception. So there are two that I found were just like so completely like shocking. Seeing this in the literature, that um, providers end up thinking that Black people have higher pain tolerance, as if like how is that the case? Of course, there are differences in people's skin, and things like that, but like that doesn't necessarily mean that nerve endings are suddenly like working differently. Like there's still human biology that works across people. So just the idea that like you somehow someone ends up having more pain tolerance on the basis of skin. Of course, some people have more tolerance than others, but like as a racial ethnic kind of thing, I don't think so. And so this is also like followed by the thought that people that are Black end up having thicker skin, like literally thicker skin, which again, like there's nothing that says that. That's not something that's taught. That's never something that like occurs in medical school. And yet that is something that medical providers are somehow walking away with. So yeah, and it's super shocking, right? That like that could even like happen for these people that are super educated, and like I mean they're smart people, right? Um, medical school is tough, and yet these other biases they still creep in. There's also things about like within the interactions when it comes to people of certain racial ethnic backgrounds. So if someone is Black, and your provider is trying to figure out a treatment option for you, that actually depends on how much is going on in their mind, basically. So it's this term called cognitive load. And if physicians have a higher cognitive load, that means there's more on their mind. For whatever reason, that just means that they're less likely to prescribe opioids, things that might reduce pain. The opposite is also true, where medical providers, if they have less on their mind, if they have a lower cognitive load, then they are more likely to prescribe it. Nothing else has changed. Nothing about the explanation has changed. Nothing about the person has changed, except for the provider. And again, These are averages. Not every provider will do this, right? But something to be aware about is like just doctors themselves, like they are going through things. They just saw like 50 patients before you potentially. Um, and now they're here and they're still thinking about like, oh, like all these other things about like these other patients and all the conditions and like what they have to research still and like things like that. And then they come here and they would just want to be able to like give you a quick treatment. And I mean, unfortunately, like it's a very like it's a fallible like process. Like you can make mistakes along the way. And so I think as individuals, we do have to advocate for ourselves and like treat them as if like, hey, like I'm the actual like, expert of my own body. Like I understand what's happening here to some degree. You have the technical expertise, but like I have the actual like experience. So we need to like hear each other out here. But of course, that can't happen that way. Stress affects everyone, right? Um, and I mean, yeah, there's plenty of things that we could do for this. It would mostly involve a lot of changes to like the medical system, but like that doesn't seem like that's going to happen anytime soon. So there are like other interventions that could happen where like we can figure out how do we actually help doctors in the moment to make sure that they're making the best decisions. And so, I mean, easily like stress reduction, like sorts of techniques that could be taught and easily implemented. Simply like breathing techniques or mindfulness techniques, like things like that, right? Like those help. And like if you just need like a short term like fix, like that's absolutely going to help. So there's that whole aspect here. Other things that go on with this. So I think we like to think of people as equal potentially. We like to assume experience of people and things like that. Unfortunately, like that's not going to work because everyone's experiences are different and their backgrounds are different and their family is different and things like that. But on average, people that are more likely to go along with treatment options such as knee surgery, let's say. Knee surgery being like, I mean, it's a pretty like major thing to have to go through. It's going to impact your life on multiple levels. But white individuals end up going along with knee surgery more often than Black individuals. So why might that be the case? Because in part, there is just the idea that white individuals have seen other people successfully go through knee operations more often, whether it is someone that is close to them, but or like someone that's at least in their like social network to some degree, compared to Black individuals that and just literally don't have that experience, and often actually like have like the opposite experience that someone could have a surgery and actually like end up like feeling worse or like really like be debilitated like for a while. So there's these kind of things that like need to be talked through, and of course like when you have no understanding of what these procedures are, or the doctors haven't taken the time to explain that to you, then you might turn to alternatives, which is also more likely for people of color in general, to turn to prayer, to turn to other alternative medicine sort of things, because there's a lack of communication between the provider and the patients. And you can see like that's a bias that needs to be corrected for. That is, whether that is like overt, like conscious, like actual discrimination could be debated, but also doesn't matter because it's happening, and so that needs to be like rectified. Okay, so I've definitely gone over time, but this is, I mean, super important that and needed the time to go over. Um, there's so many other things that go on with this. I'll leave it at this last point of insurance. That when it comes to all these other things, insurance matters so much that you're going to have access to different medical facilities, to different doctors, and different experiences because of insurance. And there's a good percentage of people that are not insured, and that, of course, again, is a factor based on race ethnicity. I believe it's 94% of white individuals have insurance, 90% of Hispanics have insurance, and then 84% of Black individuals have insurance. And of course, like I'm leaving out a lot of ethnicities here. But thinking about like who's most impacted by this, it's definitely going to be these two groups of color. And so even within that, even if you do have insurance, much more likely that those that are Hispanic and those that are Black end up having like government kind of things, right? Things like Medicaid, things like Medicare, and great programs in their own right. It makes insurance affordable, it makes procedures affordable, it makes a lot of things affordable, but also quality ends up lacking sometimes because of this. And not necessarily just because like the providers are bad, it's just because they don't have the resources to make it a high functioning facility for their patients. There are literally going to be procedures that you can't get done at some of these locations because they are there as like a safety net and to make sure that everyone has access to some degree. But what does it matter if that access isn't great, right? What you get access to isn't great. And so what I'll say with that is like you can see why something like this super like societal level sort of thing, it creeps into all these other factors that I've talked about here. It creeps into I mean, at the large level, it just literally means that you're not going to go to certain locations because you can't afford it, you can't go out of network, whatever. But then how it might end up influencing things like the actual communication that happens between the patient and the provider, the other like discriminatory factors that go into this, that like you can be like typeset in a certain way, you can be stereotyped in a certain way because you're someone who has this like low basis insurance. And off of that alone, again, because that's so coupled with the color of our skin, that ends up reducing the quality of your care. And of course, not right. But what do people do about that? That means that you're going to be less likely to actually go to that provider. You're going to be less likely to go to that facility. And that could be for just emotional reasons. That could be for practical reasons too, that like, you're not going to get the care that you need anyway from that place. They're going to send you off to a different place, and then you have to pay extra money to go to this other place. Yeah, I mean, maybe if we go back to like the idea of just like knee surgery, like you won't necessarily get that knee surgery at that place that you go to, as opposed to if you went to like a private practice that like has their whole like hospital that like serves people that are affluent, that have money. They likely just have the resources and they can do something about that, right? So again, what do people do? You might cope in certain ways. You might just like focus more on your emotions and feel like just like trying to feel good enough rather than getting the care that you need. Maybe that means like I literally have to think about I have a certain amount of money, and that money can either go to me taking care of my pain, or that can go to like my family. And that also, I mean, both of these things show up in research that given the choice, people of color might end up actually choosing I can use this money for my family rather than for my pain. I'm just gonna like keep going and keep doing my duties here. So I say all this, right? I say all this not necessarily as like truths and that this is going to happen for every individual. I say this as points of conversation that need to be occurring, that need to be happening, particularly between their patients and the providers. But they don't. They don't necessarily happen. Again, some people I'm sure do. Some people, some providers will have the education and like the knowledge and that experience that like, oh, I should be asking like these questions and like actually understanding like the patient's life, so I understand what treatments to give them and how to explain it to them and like things like that. literally also like language, like can I have an interpreter in the room? Which like of course that has like so many other potential like pros and cons, but like at least the language is like you're speaking the right language at that level, right? Like that's a whole other thing, like, and that could deserve its own podcast episode. um so okay, like I said, those are some of the things that go into this idea. When it comes to pain, we cannot be neglecting these factors, these psychological factors that vary across race ethnicity, these social factors that vary across race ethnicity, the structural factors as well. And so I want to go ahead and wrap this up, but I will repeat that this is meant to be a conversation. This is not meant to be like the truth and like you walk away as like this is the only way that things can ever happen. There are plenty of positive cases that happen. There are plenty of people of all different ethnicities that get the help that they need. It is just unfortunate that it's more likely that if you're a person of color, you're not going to get the help that you need, and all of these factors contribute to that. So um, I yeah, this has potentially been heavy again. So if it was, I hope that you still got something from this. I hope that you still were able to hear something that like resonated with you and your experience, and something that you can maybe also take into your next visit potentially. And you can try to like dictate that conversation and like bring up things that like maybe you're assuming your provider knows, but actually if they have no clue, and that you need to bring up so that both sides are more educated on like what to do going forward. So I'm going to leave this here. Um, I hope that there's something positive that comes out of this conversation. I hope that I also hear from you all, and I want to hear like, is this your experience? Is this not your experience? And maybe why or why not? Who knows? But something would be good, and that will help make research that much better, and hopefully also get back to you that much better. So, what are we doing coming up? I do want to talk about ways that we can help like rectify some of these things, some of these biases, and also like what helps actual like pain patients, because at the end of the day, like yes, all these things occur, but like still we live in a world like what, so what, like we need to do something about that. Like we can't just like leave it here. So what actually does help? And then also thinking just about like how can we improve pain communication and measurement and things like that. So that's what's going to be coming up in the next couple of weeks. And in the meantime, we have a whole bunch of other content that is still being produced. These infographics, the write-ups, the blog posts, all of that is still going to be up. So I have all that on pain and on many other topics. So please check it out. That is going to be on roomforresearch.com, and then also on our social media, that is Room for Research. That is on all major platforms. So feel free to check that out. And until next time, thank you. Thank you for your time. Again, this is a lot. It's a process. So I hope that you can take the time to process this and walk away with something of use here. So until next time, bye for now.
With the sun will breathe.